The wolves came back to the hold on the first morning of the thaw, and they were alive. I had not expected that. When I rode out of Veldmore in the last days of autumn, I had left 12 wolves in the Eastern Ridge pens, good animals, trained, worth more than 3 of the soldiers I'd brought with me to the southern campaigns. I had left instruction with my steward, Corin, to see them through winter. Corin had a warm house and a ledger and 20 years of service to the crown of Veldmore, and I had trusted him the way a man trusts a wall he has never seen tested. The wall had not held. Corin's message reached me in the south in the deep of the killing season. Fever, he wrote, and a bad fall on ice, and the young man he'd delegated to the wolves had run at the first hard snow. He was sorry. He hoped some of the animals had found shelter in the pine wood. I read the letter twice. Then I gave it to the fire and did not speak of it again to anyone. I had ridden south with 40 men and come back with 31. I was not in a mood to calculate further losses. But the wolves were alive. They were in the yard when I rode through the eastern gate on the first morning after the thaw broke the ridge road open, all 12 of them, lean from the winter but upright, coats rough and bright-eyed, pressing against the fence rails in a way that told me they had been fed regularly and handled with patience. The kind of condition that takes daily work, not luck. I pulled my horse up in the yard and looked at them for a long moment. The cold was still sharp in the air, the kind that lives in the shadow of the pines even after the sun returns, and the ground was half mud, half ice where the melt had gotten into the yard. "Who kept them?" I said. My captain, Bren, had ridden out an hour before me to check the territory. He was waiting beside the fence, and he had a look on his face that I had learned, over 15 years of service together, meant he was uncertain how I would receive what he was about to say. "A woman," he said, "from the eastern settlements, a widow." I looked at the wolves again. The nearest one, a gray female I had trained myself from a pup 3 years ago, was watching me with calm, patient eyes. She was not nervous. She had eaten recently. She had not been left in the cold. "What woman?" I said. "Her name is Marin," Bren said. "Her mate served in the 3rd Ridge Company. He died in the Keldrath Passes 2 winters ago before your campaign south. She took the holding at the edge of your eastern land after, small place. She trades a little weaving and some dried stores in the settlement market." He paused. "She has no wolf of her own. She lost it when her mate died. Sometimes the bond breaks that way when a mated pair." "I know how it works," I said. He was quiet. I dismounted and walked to the fence. The gray female came to me at once, pressing her nose against my palm, and I held still for her. Her weight against my hand was real and warm. She came every day. Every day since the first snow, according to the settlements. She brought dried meat and grain mix. She broke the water when it froze. She slept in the pen twice when one of the younger males was feverish. Bren cleared his throat. "She asked nothing for it. She didn't know when you'd be back, or if she didn't know the campaign timeline. She just kept coming." I stood at that fence for a while after he finished. The gray female leaned into my hand. "Where does she live?" I said. The Eastern Ridge Road in the first days of thaw is not a comfortable ride. The mud is deep, and the pine roots heave in the cold, wet ground, and the light comes in at a low angle through the trees that makes everything look older than it is, quieter. I had ridden this road 100 times. I knew it the way I knew the weight of the crown my father had placed on my head the morning he died, not fondly, not bitterly, simply completely. I rode it alone. I did not bring Bren. I told him I was inspecting the ridge boundary, and he nodded with the particular careful blankness of a man who has decided not to ask questions. The holding appeared through the trees in the late morning light, a stone house, small, solid, with a good roof, and a yard that had been well kept before winter, and was now in the process of being reclaimed from mud and damp. There was a kitchen garden along the south wall that had been put to bed correctly in autumn, the beds edged and covered, ready for the planting season. There was a woodpile that had been seriously depleted but not exhausted. There was a low stone wall around the yard that someone had repaired recently, the new mortar still pale against the old. She was in the yard when I came through the gate. She had her back to me, working on the wall, a section that had come apart in the freeze, the stones tumbled and waiting to be reset. She was wearing a work dress the color of undyed wool and a heavy cloak that had seen better decades, and her dark hair was pinned up in the practical way of a woman who needs her hands free, and she was fitting a stone into the gap with the focused attention of someone who has decided a thing is going to be done correctly or not at all. She heard my horse and turned. I had been prepared for many things. I was the Alpha King of Veldmore. I had stood at the edge of battles that should have ended my line and come back from all of them. I had been prepared, in a dim professional way, to feel gratitude, the clean, manageable kind, the kind that resolves into payment and acknowledgement and a ride home. I was not prepared for what my wolf did. It was not a dramatic thing. It was not a surge or a howl or the desperate lunge of something long caged. It was a settling, like a word spoken at the end of a long sentence, like something that had been held at a careful distance for a very long time, recognizing that it could now, finally, set itself down. She had dark eyes and a composed face and flour on her left hand from whatever she had been doing before the wall, and she looked at me without fear and without fawning, which was unusual enough in itself. Most people, when the Alpha King of Veldmore appeared unexpectedly in their yard, performed something, either alarm or elaborate deference. She did neither. She simply looked at me with the measured attention of someone trying to determine what a situation required of her. "My lord," she said, her voice was even, "I wasn't told to expect you." "No," I said, "you weren't." I dismounted and tied my horse to the fence post and stood in her yard, and felt my wolf doing something it had not done in a very long time, which was pay attention. "I came about the wolves," I said. Something moved in her face, a small caution, a bracing. "I hope they're well. I worried the gray female, she had a rough February. She was off her food for nearly 2 weeks and I wasn't sure." "They're well," I said, "better than I had reason to expect." She let out a slow breath. "Good," she said, and the simplicity of it, the way the word carried only relief, nothing else, no angle, no expectation, was not what I had come out here to find, and I found it nevertheless. "I owe you a debt," I said. She shook her head, a small motion, not dismissive but definite. "You don't. Corin is," she stopped. "Your steward had a difficult winter. I live close. The wolves needed someone. You could have sent word to the settlement steward and let the crown handle it." "Yes," she said. "But by the time the message reached anyone and the crown made an arrangement, 2 of them would have been dead." She said it matter-of-factly, without accusation, just the shape of a practical problem she had solved. The young male, the gray female, they were the weakest going into winter. I looked at her for a moment. "You knew which ones were vulnerable." "I watched them for a few days before I started bringing food," she said. "It seemed worth knowing." I had ridden east expecting to pay a debt and return to my council's waiting lists of decisions, and a stack of post-campaign correspondence that had been growing in my absence. I had expected a short conversation and a reasonable settlement, grain, coin, a formal acknowledgement, the kind of thing a king manages in a morning. I stayed for the rest of the day. I told Bren I was spending 3 days on the eastern ridge, assessing the winter damage to the boundary markers. It was not entirely false. There was legitimate work in it, and I did in fact spend 2 full mornings on the boundary, in the company of my ridge captain and a surveying crew, walking the line in the mud. But the afternoons I rode east. She fed me the first afternoon without making anything of it, set a bowl of the same stew she was eating on her own table and sat across from it, and talked about the state of the eastern settlements with the frankness of someone who had nothing to protect and no ambition to manage. The flooding in the lower fields, The argument between two settlement families about a shared water right. The condition of the eastern road after the hard winter. She talked about these things the way a practical person talks about practical problems. Not to impress, not to position herself, simply because they were the true state of the territory and she thought I should know it. I listened. I found that I was, with unusual attention, listening. "Your steward hasn't ridden the eastern settlement since autumn," she said at one point, without emphasis, as if this were simply a fact. "The families there, they're good people, they work hard, but they've felt overlooked this winter. A difficult season and no word from the crown." "I'll address that," I said. She nodded once and asked if I wanted more stew. My wolf was doing that settled thing again, not insistent, not urgent. Just present, attentive in the way of a creature that has found the thing it was looking for and is now simply, quietly sure. I did not say anything about it. I was the Alpha King of Veldmore. I had a council and a court, and a list of potential political alliances that my chancellor had been preparing since before I rode south, and none of those preparations included a widow on the eastern ridge with flower on her hand, and a collapsed section of stone wall in her yard. I rode back to the hold in the late afternoon and looked at my correspondence and did not read it. The second day I brought her a new section of mortar and 2 good stones from the quarry at the north edge of the boundary, because the stone in her wall section was soft shale and was going to fail again by the next hard freeze, and I had been thinking about it since the day before. Bren looked at me with complete blankness when I loaded the stones onto the pack horse. He said nothing. He was, as I have said, a man who knew when not to ask questions. She was surprised by the stones. She was more surprised, I think, by the fact that I helped her set them. I knew the work. I had spent enough winters on campaign building field fortifications to know how to seat a stone, and the wall was not a complex problem. We worked on it for an hour in the pale afternoon sun, and she was quick and competent beside me, and we did not talk much, which suited us both. When the section was done, she stepped back and looked at it with the same focused attention she brought to everything. "That's going to hold," she said. "Yes," I said. She looked at me sidelong for a moment, and I thought she was going to say something about the stones or the mortar or the work. Instead she said, "You didn't have to come back." "No," I said, "I didn't." She held my gaze for a beat, a fraction longer than was strictly conversational, and then she turned and said she was going to put water on for tea, and I followed her inside, and my wolf held its quiet certainty like a cupped flame. On the third day, I met Myra. I had not known there was a child. She was 5 years old, small for her age and dark-haired like her mother, with the serious eyes of a child who had grown up in a household where seriousness was a survival skill. She came in from the backyard while I was sitting at the table with a cup of tea and looked at me with an assessment so frank and thorough that I nearly smiled. "Are you the king?" she said. "Yes," I said. She thought about this. "My papa served the king," she said. "Mama said he was brave." There is a particular kind of quiet that falls in a room when something true has been said by someone who doesn't yet know how heavy truth can be. I sat inside that quiet for a moment. "He was," I said. "I knew the Third Ridge Company's records. I knew every man who died in the Keldrath Passes. I knew Marin's mate's name, Thuron, a Ridge scout, cited 3 times for courage, killed when a patrol was ambushed in the early dawn. He had died well. He had died the way good men die when the ground is hard and the enemy doesn't give warning. He was a good soldier." Myra regarded this information with the solemnity it deserved. Then she climbed up onto the bench beside me and showed me a small carved wolf she was apparently in the middle of painting, which required my immediate expert consultation on whether the brown or the gray was a more accurate color for wolves generally, and whether it mattered if the legs were slightly different lengths. I spent 20 minutes on this question. I concluded that gray was accurate for winter coats, and that wolves in the wild often stood slightly unevenly on rough ground, and the carving was therefore realistic. Myra accepted this verdict with satisfaction. Marin was watching from the doorway when I looked up. She had an expression on her face that she was controlling very carefully, but underneath the control there was something that I recognized, not sentimentality, not calculation, something more complicated and more private than either. She looked, for just a moment, like a woman who had been holding a great deal alone for a very long time and was startled to find someone else in the room with her. I rode back to the hold that evening and told Bren I was extending the Eastern inspection. He looked at me for a long, careful moment. "How long?" he said. "I'll let you know," I said. 3 days became 10. 10 became 3 weeks. I was not hiding it. I was the Alpha King of Veldmore. I did not hide things from my own court. I simply did not explain them. I rode east in the afternoons and I came back in the evenings, and I did my morning work with the focus of a man determined to earn the time he was spending in another direction. My Eastern survey was genuine. My boundary assessments were thorough. The report I sent to my chancellor at the end of the first week was the most detailed inspection document the Eastern Ridge had produced in 8 years. But every afternoon I rode east. Marin never asked me to come. She never asked me not to come either. She received me with the same practical, unperformative steadiness she brought to everything. Set a place at her table, talked frankly, worked on her spring garden preparation while I sat on the low stone wall in the pale sun, and sometimes said nothing at all for long stretches in a way that I found, unexpectedly, more restful than conversation. My wolf had stopped settling and started attending. There is a difference. Settling is recognition, the quiet arrival of certainty. Attending is the active, careful presence of a creature that has found what it was looking for and is now entirely occupied with learning every detail of it. Every afternoon I stayed a little longer. Every morning I thought about what I had left undone in my correspondence, and then thought about the angle of the light on the Eastern Ridge Road, and did not open the correspondence first. I learned things. She had been on the Eastern Ridge for 2 years. She had built her kitchen garden herself, breaking the ground in early spring after Thuron's death, because she had needed something to do with her hands that required sustained, difficult effort and produced a visible result. She had inherited the house from a maternal aunt who had no children, a piece of luck she did not describe as luck but as practical timing. She traded well in the settlement market and had enough, she said, meaning that she had sufficient and did not require abundance, and had made her peace with that calculation. She read. She had a shelf of books, histories mostly, a few practical texts on agriculture and building, a worn volume of northern folk stories she had been reading to Myra since the child was old enough to sit still. She had opinions about all of them that were brisk and clear and occasionally surprising. She had not expected to survive her mate's death the way she had. She said this once carefully, looking at her hands in her lap, not asking for anything in response. She said it the way a person states a fact about geography, a thing that is simply true about the land. "I thought it would be worse," she said. "The first winter was. But then the garden was there and Myra was there and the work was there and eventually I found I was still going." "Yes," I said. "I knew something about that. I did not say so." She looked at me, and I thought she understood anyway. My wolf had no name for what it was doing anymore. It was simply there, at the edge of everything I thought and did, the way a fixed star is at the edge of the dark sky. Present, oriented, certain in a way that required no argument and admitted no revision. I was not, by temperament or by practice, a man who moved slowly toward things he wanted. I had led campaigns. I had made decisions under fire. I had inherited a kingdom at 22 and held it through 7 years of border conflicts and political maneuvering with the patience and precision of a man who had learned early that the cost of being wrong was paid in other people's lives. I understood, riding east on the 14th afternoon, that the patience I had applied to all of those things was not going to be available to me in this situation. My wolf was patient. I was becoming something else. She was in her garden when I arrived, setting the first seedlings of the spring into prepared ground, and the sun was past the middle of the day, and the ridge had the soft, early smell of warming earth after a long freeze, and I tied my horse and walked across the yard and stopped behind her. She looked up. "You're earlier than usual," she said. "I finished the North Boundary Report," I said, which was true, and said nothing about how quickly I had worked through the morning to make it true. She sat back on her heels and looked at me with those dark, measured eyes. There was a new smear of soil on her cheek that she was apparently unaware of. My wolf was very still and very loud at the same time, which is a thing I would not have known was possible before that afternoon. "Aldrich," she said, and it was the first time she had used my name, not my title, and I think she realized it in the saying because she paused. "Yes," I said. "What are you doing?" she said. It was a fair question. It deserved a fair answer. I said, "I'm not entirely certain of all of it. I am certain of some of it." She waited. "My wolf has been certain since the first day I rode into this yard," I said. "I have been working toward certainty, at a slower pace." She looked at me for a long, still moment. The garden smelled of new earth and the cold that still lived under the warmth. A wind came through the pines at the edge of her yard and moved the new leaves on the kitchen garden bed. "I am a widow," she said, "with a child, on a small holding. I have no wolf, no bloodline, no land of my own by right." "I know what you have," I said. "Then you know what your council will say." "Yes," I said, "I know exactly what they will say." She held my gaze. I held hers. My wolf had stopped attending and started knowing, which is a further stage, the final one, the place beyond recognition and certainty, where there is simply the bone-deep, unrevocable knowledge that this is the person, and there is not going to be another. "I'm not asking you for anything today," I said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not here to press or to claim or to put a name on it before you're ready to hear one. I'm just telling you, so you know." She looked at me for another long moment. Then she turned back to her seedlings and said, "There's food on the stove. Go inside and eat something. You've been riding since morning." I went inside and ate something. My wolf was quietly, entirely satisfied. My council came to the eastern hold on the first clear week of proper spring. I had been expecting them. Lord Casver had sent 3 letters in the past month, each more pointed than the last, about the question of an alliance marriage with the Western Valdreth territories. A match that was strategically sensible, politically useful, and completely beside the point of anything I was thinking about. My chancellor had sent 2 letters of his own, more tactful, which were in their own way more pointed. And Bren, who never spoke when he could stay usefully silent, had said once very quietly, "They're going to ride out here, you know." And I had said, "Yes, I know," and we had not discussed it again. There were 6 of them: Casver, my Chancellor Dreth, 2 members of the Border Council, and 2 others whose names I include for accuracy, but whose contribution to the day's events was minimal. They arrived in the morning while I was in conference with the Ridge Captain about the spring patrol schedule, and by afternoon they had arranged themselves in the hold's main room with the settled air of men who have decided a thing is going to be addressed. I let them speak first. Casver was not a bad man. I want to be accurate about this. He was a practical man, which is not the same thing, and his practicality had a particular shape that I had navigated for 8 years. He laid out the Valdreth match with the efficiency of a man who has been thinking about it for a long time and is now ready to be finished with it. The family was good. The alliance was strategically valuable. The woman in question was said to be sensible and presentable. And the matter of the eastern settlements, Dreth said, careful as always, not looking at me directly. "There is some talk about your inspection, the duration of it." "The eastern ridge has been underseen," I said. You all know this. The report I sent last week covers it thoroughly." "The report is excellent," Dreth said. "Thorough, as you say." A pause. "The talk is about the widow." There was a silence in the room. Casver looked at me with the expression of a man who has prepared for this, and is ready to be sensible, and is about to be. "She kept my wolves alive through the killing season," I said. "Yes," Casver said, "we know, and it was commendably resourceful. She should be compensated appropriately, generously even," but he paused. He chose his words the way a man chooses footing on uncertain ground. "She is a widow, wolfless, no bloodline of note, no land by right, a very small holding, a child." He said the last word without unkindness and in a tone that nonetheless made it a point in a ledger. "You are the Alpha King of Veldmore. The Valdrath match is—" "Lord Casver," I said. He stopped. "I know what the Valdrath match is," I said. "I know what you're going to say about it. I've known for some time." I looked around the room. "I'm going to tell you plainly what I've decided, and then we're going to ride east together, and I am going to introduce you." Casver opened his mouth. "That is not a proposal," I said. "It's an announcement." They rode east with me in the late afternoon. I had sent Bren ahead not to warn her. I wanted nothing staged, nothing managed, but simply to say the king was coming with counsel and she should not be alarmed, and whatever she was doing was what she should continue to do. Bren, who understood the value of accurate information, had delivered that message precisely. She was splitting wood in the yard when we rode through the gate. It was not, by the standards of the things I have seen in my life as a king, a grand setting. The yard was good spring mud and old stone, and the smell of pine and cut wood, and the kitchen garden coming up in its beds along the south wall. Myra was sitting on the low stone wall I had helped repair, watching her mother work, and looked up when we came through the gate with the same thorough, unimpressed assessment she brought to everything. Maren set down her axe and turned to face 6 lords of Veldmore and her king in her yard. She looked at me first. I looked back at her. Her expression asked a question I did not have time to answer fully, so I answered the part of it I could with a small nod that I hoped conveyed, "I know, stay steady. You are not in this alone." Something settled in her face. She lifted her chin by a fraction and turned to face my counsel. Casver had been managing his expression all the way down the eastern road. He managed it now, contained, careful, the face of a man taking stock. I knew what he was seeing: a small yard, a practical house, a woman in a work dress with capable hands and good posture and dark eyes that were not intimidated by 6 lords on horseback, and were not trying to be impressive, and were simply present, composed, measuring the situation with the same attention she brought to a wall that needed to hold through winter. "This," I said, "is Maren of the Eastern Ridge." Casver inclined his head slightly, the minimum civility. "She kept 12 wolves alive through a killing season," I said, "alone, without being asked, without knowing when or whether I would return." I let that sit for a moment in the air. "She has held this part of my territory better than I left it, better than my steward held it. Better, I will be direct with you, than some of the arrangements this council has made on my behalf." "My lord," Casver said, "that is acknowledged truly, but—" "Lord Casver," I said, "I'm going to tell you what the bond has been telling me since the first afternoon I rode into this yard." There was a silence. In the Wolfpack territories of Veldmore, the bond is not a metaphor. It is not a sentiment or a romantic convention. It is a thing that the pack has understood for 10 generations, a thing that is as real as the stone of the hold and the line of the ridge and the law that my father handed to me the morning I became king. It does not negotiate. It does not make political concessions. It does not weigh strategic alliances against its own knowledge. I said, "She is mine, and I am hers." That is what the bond says, and it has been saying it for a month, and I have made my peace with the fact that neither I nor this council have any authority over it. Caspar looked at me for a long time. Then he looked at Maren. She looked back at him. She was very still and very composed and not performing either quality. She was simply that way, the way a well-built wall is simply solid because it was made to be. She has no wolf, he said, not aggressively, almost as if he were checking, verifying, making sure of the obstacle before he named it. The bond does not require it, I said. You know this. Your Luna will be Maren, I said, of the Eastern Ridge. And I will hear any practical questions you have about the transition and the announcement, but I will not hear arguments against the thing itself, because that question is settled. Another silence. The spring afternoon held it, the sun low and clean over the ridge, the kitchen garden green along the wall, Myra still sitting on the stone fence regarding the proceedings with profound 5-year-old gravity. It was Lord Dreth, my chancellor, who moved first. He dismounted. He was a quiet man, Dreth, careful, precise, and I had always suspected more perceptive than he let on in council. He dismounted and he stood in the yard of a woman he had not known existed 6 weeks ago, and he inclined his head toward her. Not the minimum civility, a real inclination, a thing that meant something. My lady, he said, it seems I have a great deal of work to arrange. Something happened in the room that was not quite a room, something that happens in the open air when a group of men in positions of power simultaneously realize that the ground has shifted and the new configuration is, in fact, stable. Caspar dismounted. Then the others. They did not bow, that was for later, for the formal presentation, for the court at Veldmore with its full protocol. But they were on the ground, and she was on the ground, and the distance between those two things had become something navigable. Maren looked at me one more time, then she looked at Lord Dreth. My Lord Chancellor, she said, there's stew on the stove and I'll need to start the bread for tonight. Can any of you make yourselves useful, or should I assume not? Dreth blinked. Then, with the expression of a man who has just been caught genuinely off balance for the first time in years, he said, I can manage a hearth fire if the wood is already split. The wood's in the yard, she said, and turned to go inside. Come on, then. The bond is not a quiet thing once it is acknowledged. I want to be clear about this for anyone who has not experienced it. It is not the still, settled certainty of those first weeks, the attentive warmth that had grown steadily through every afternoon on the Eastern Ridge. Once it is named, once it is given air and shape and the full weight of acknowledgement, it becomes something larger. Not louder, the bond is never loud. It does not shout or demand or consume, but larger. The way of fire is larger when you stop containing it in a small hearth and let it breathe. That evening, after my council had eaten Maren's stew and ridden back to the hold in the cooling dark, I stayed. I had not planned to. I sat at her table after the meal with a cup of tea and watched Myra show me the progress she had made on the painted wolf. The gray coat was done now. Well done. Better than I would have expected from a 5-year-old. And I said so honestly. And I looked up and found that the evening had gone long and the fire had burned low and Myra had been put to bed, and Maren was at the table across from me with her own tea, watching me. You didn't have to do that, she said. The way you said it, you could have handled it differently. I could have, I said. I didn't want to. She was quiet for a moment. Caspar is going to be difficult about the Valdrath match. Yes, I said. Caspar is going to be difficult, and then he's going to accept it and make the best of it because he is, at the bottom of it, a practical man, and the practical calculation here is not complicated. I looked at her. The bond chose. I am not going to argue with the bond. She looked back at me. The fire was very low and the room was warm, and there was a quality to the silence between us that had changed, not in its steadiness, which was the same as it had always been, but in its openness. As if a door that had been closed, not locked but simply latched, had been allowed to swing open. I need you to understand something, she said. Tell me, I said. I'm not going to be a different person, she said. I'm not going to learn to navigate court politics and wear the right things and manage the right conversations and become something I'm not because it would be more convenient. She said it plainly, without defiance, the way she said everything, as a fact she was presenting accurately. I will learn what I need to learn. I will do what the position requires, but I will not stop being this. I know, I said. You say that now. I have been watching you be this for a month, I said. I have been riding east every afternoon to see it. I know exactly what this is. I held her gaze. It is what I want. It is specifically and entirely what I want, not a version of it that is more convenient. This. She looked at me for a long moment. Her face was doing the thing it had done the day Myra had spoken to me about her father, the careful containment, and underneath it, something large and quiet and careful. All right, she said finally, all right. I did not stay later than was right. I rode back to the hold in the full dark with my wolf carrying the warmth of the evening like a coal held in the hand, and I did not try to name what I was carrying or what it weighed or what it was going to require. I let it be exactly what it was. The formal presentation was held at the Veldmore Court 3 weeks later, in the main hall with its long windows and its stone floor and the carved wolves along the gallery rail that my great-grandmother had commissioned in the year the kingdom was settled. It was full, the full court, the border lords, the settlement leaders who had been summoned, the pack families from the 6 territories. My chancellor had arranged it with his usual precise efficiency, and the hall was lit and dressed, and as formal as the crown of Veldmore could make it. Maren came in through the east entrance with Myra at her hand. She was dressed well. My tailor had been sent to the Eastern Ridge the week before with fabric and specific instructions, and the result was a deep green gown in a style that was formal without being theatrical, that suited her practical bearing rather than conflicting with it. She wore her hair up the same way she always did, for the same reason she always did. Her hands were free. She was paying attention. She walked into the Veldmore Court the way she split wood and set mortar and broke ice on the Wolf Pen water, with the direct, grounded focus of a person who has decided a thing is going to be done correctly. She looked at me when she reached the front of the hall. I looked back at her. My wolf was very still and very certain, the way it had been still and certain since the first day in the yard. Lord Casver was in his place at the front of the left gallery. He had, as I had predicted, made his peace. He had done it with the particular efficiency of a man who has decided that continued resistance is impractical and that the best available course is dignified acceptance. He was dignified. He stood straight. When Dreth made the formal introduction and Maren's name was spoken in the hall, Casver inclined his head. A real inclination. He had learned something from Dreth's example in the yard, apparently, or from his own calculation, or from both. It did not matter. It was real. I stepped down from the dais. The hall was very quiet. The carved wolves along the gallery rail were very still. Myra, at her mother's side, was watching everything with the grave, comprehensive attention of a child, who understands that she is witnessing something significant even if she does not yet know all of what it means. I took the riding cloak from my shoulders, not the formal ceremonial piece, not the state regalia, but the heavy wool cloak I had ridden east in all those afternoons, the one that smelled of pine and the Eastern Ridge Road and the particular quality of early spring air in the mountains. I had brought it specifically. Dreth had raised an eyebrow about it and said nothing. I settled it around Maren's shoulders. It was too large. The hem was past her hands and pooled at her feet, and the shoulders were wrong for hers. It did not matter. She stood inside it with the same composure she brought to everything, and looked up at me, and there was something in her face that was not the careful containment I had come to know, and was not something she was managing. It was simply joy, not a performance of it, the small, surprised, entirely genuine thing. Maren, I said, quietly enough that it was between us, though the hall was quiet enough that it carried. Luna of Veldmore, my fated mate. She held my gaze. Aldrich, she said, my king. Behind her, the hall fell into the silence that precedes the bow, the collective held breath of a room registering a change in the weight of the world. Then Dreth bowed. Then the border lords. Then the settlement leaders and the pack families and the carved wolves watched impassively from the gallery rail, while the Veldmore court bent itself toward the woman who had kept 12 wolves alive through a killing season, and asked nothing in return and had, in the end, received everything. In the left gallery, Lord Casver bowed last. He bowed fully. Myra, at her mother's side, looked up at the bowing hall with the expression of a child who finds that the world has arranged itself in a satisfying configuration. And then she reached up and took the edge of the riding cloak and wrapped it around herself too, so that they were both inside it, her and her mother, and looked at me with the frank dark eyes that were her mother's. "Are we staying?" she said. I looked at my fated mate. My Luna, the woman who had ridden out every morning into a killing winter to feed 12 wolves in a pen, and asked nothing, and needed no one to witness it to make it worth doing. "Yes," I said, "we're staying." There is a thing that happens in the eastern settlements in the late spring, when the thaw has finished its work and the ridge road has dried and the kitchen gardens are properly up. The pack families hold a gathering, not a formal thing, not a court occasion, just the settlements coming together the way they do after a long winter, with food and fire and the quiet relief of people who have survived something difficult and are now willing to set it down. We went. I had not attended the Eastern Settlement gathering before. It was not traditionally a crown occasion. Dreth had flagged it with a note about protocol, and then added, in his careful hand, that he supposed protocol could accommodate some expansion. Marin had been going every year since she arrived on the Eastern Ridge. She moved through the gathering the way she moved through everything, directly, without ceremony, stopping to talk to people she knew, receiving news from the settlement families with the same attentive interest she had always brought to the territory's practical concerns. Myra ran free in the way of children at gatherings, pursuing other children through the firelight with the focused energy of someone who has been patient all week and is now done being patient. People looked at her differently now. Not all of them had fully absorbed what it meant. It had been only 3 weeks since the court presentation, and some of them were still working through it, recalibrating the map of the world they had been carrying. But the ones who knew her best, the families who had traded with her at the winter market and seen her ride out in the dark months with dried meat and grain mix in her saddlebag, those people looked at her with a particular expression that I recognized after a while. It was not surprise. It was recognition. The satisfied recognition of people watching the world arrange itself into the shape it should have had all along. I stood at the edge of the firelight and watched her talk to a settlement farmer about the condition of the lower field drainage, and my wolf held its certainty the way it had held it since the first afternoon, steady and complete and requiring no argument. She looked across the firelight and found me, the way she had started doing, not looking for reassurance, not checking, simply acknowledging, a thing between us that needed no words. She had always been that way, direct and unsentimental, and the bond had made it neither more nor less true, simply more fully itself. Myra appeared at my knee from somewhere in the dark, pink-cheeked and satisfied from whatever she had been chasing. She held up the painted wolf. She had brought it, apparently. "I told them you helped me with the color," she said. "They didn't believe me." "Did you tell them which part I helped with?" She considered. "No." "Tell them I confirmed that gray was accurate for winter coats," I said. "That part they can verify." She gave me the look her mother gave me when she found something both reasonable and slightly exasperating, which was an expression I had apparently earned in both of them, and ran back into the firelight. The Eastern Ridge Settlement gathering went on until well past dark, the way these things do when a winter has been long and the spring is real and the fire is warm and no one has anywhere they must be. I stayed until the end. I sat beside my Luna on a bench near the fire and listened to the settlements talk about their spring plans and their winter grievances and the ongoing water right argument between the two families, which Marin had thoughts about that were characteristically precise and probably correct. When we rode home on the ridge road in the dark, Myra asleep across my horse's neck and the pines smelling of late warmth, Marin rode beside me, and the bond was warm between us, and the eastern ridge was, finally, properly seen. I did not become a different kind of king. I want to be clear about this, as I have tried to be clear about everything in this account. I did not become soft or neglectful or blind to the realities of governing a wolf-pack kingdom in the Northern Territories. I did not stop being the man who makes hard decisions and bears the weight of them, who holds the line in difficult seasons, who is responsible for 31 soldiers and 12 wolves, and a council that requires managing and a territory that requires attention. I became, if anything, more effective at it. Because when you have someone at your table who will tell you the true state of the eastern settlements without managing you or positioning for advantage, who will say, your steward hasn't ridden these roads since autumn, with the straightforward precision of someone who thinks you should simply know that, you end up knowing the true state of your territory. And when you know the true state of your territory, you are better at governing it. That is not a sentiment. That is a practical fact. The Valdrath match did not happen. Casver found another arrangement for the alliance, one that did not require a marriage, and presented it with the slightly satisfied air of a man who has demonstrated that he can solve problems creatively. I approved it. He and I understood each other better after that spring than we had in the previous 8 years of council service, which was, I thought, not a coincidence. Dreth reorganized the Eastern settlement records and oversaw the appointment of a new steward for the Eastern Ridge, one who would ride the roads and who would have the Eastern settlement families' respect before they had to earn it the hard way. He consulted Marin on the appointment, which had not been my idea but was Dreth's, and which was, it turned out, the right call. The wolves healed fully through spring and early summer. The gray female, Bren told me, had taken to checking on the eastern holding in the early mornings when the gate was left open. She would pad down the ridge road and sit in Marin's yard until someone came out, and then she would accept a piece of dried meat and pad back to the hold. Marin said this happened at least 3 times a week. She seemed to regard it as entirely reasonable. Myra learned the wolf's name and took it upon herself to teach the gray female to perform a handshake, which the wolf accepted with the resigned cooperation of a very large animal that has decided a small person's expectations are simply part of the world now. I watched this happen one morning from the yard gate. The spring had fully arrived. The kitchen garden was up properly. The ridge road was dry. The pines were the deep green of their growing season, and the morning light on the eastern ridge was the particular clear gold that comes after a long cold winter when the warmth is finally real. My wolf was at rest, not the attentive, oriented rest of the early weeks, not the careful, certain rest of the middle ones, the deep rest. The kind that means the seeking is over, the searching done, the distance from oneself to another finally closed. Marin came out of the house with a cup of tea and stood beside me at the gate, watching Myra and the wolf conduct their ongoing educational session. She's going to convince it to carry her eventually, Marin said. Probably, I said. The wolf has questionable judgment about that child. We all do, she said, and leaned slightly against my shoulder, the way she had started doing, easy, unperformative, as natural as the stone wall and the morning light. I covered her hand with mine. The bond held what it had always held, steady, certain, requiring nothing more than what it already had. My Luna, my fated mate. The woman who had fed my wolves through winter and asked nothing and received, in the end, a king who would not leave her door. The gray wolf turned and looked at us over Myra's enthusiastic attempts at the handshake lesson. She wagged her tail once, slowly, with great dignity, and turned back to her student. The ridge held us in the spring morning, and I thought that this was, for all the ways I had not expected it and could not have planned it and would not have known to want it, exactly the right configuration of the world.